Welcome back to the Wine School. This week we're looking at California, and next time we're looking at the whole of the rest of the USA. And you might wonder why we're doing it in that slightly disproportionate way, and this is simply because California is disproportionately large in the wine scene. It accounts for 90% of the US production, and in terms of world production, it's actually fourth on its own, just that one state behind France, Italy and Spain in terms of production. It's a huge amount of wine comes out of California. Historically, as in much of the New World, wine was brought over initially by missionaries. The most widely planted grape was the mission grape, which we talked about when we were looking at Argentina and Chile. In Chile it's called Pais, and in Argentina Criolla, Chica. In the mid-19th century, the gold rush brought a huge influx of immigrants, most of them from Europe, a lot of them from Italy. The grape we now know as Zinfandel, which is synonymous with a lot of California, has now been identified as Italy's Primitivo, and this was clearly brought over at that time. There's also a lot of Barbera and Sangiovese, which there's some lovely old plantings of around, and some new plantings, because they're realising it really suits a lot of California's climate, these Italian varietals. So in the future I think we'll be seeing a lot more of those. Naturally enough, a lot of people try to emulate the classic wine styles of France, Bordeaux, Burgundy, so there's a lot of Cabernet and Chardonnay planted in California. It was traditionally made in that style because a lot of the European settlers were familiar with that style, so naturally enough they wanted to emulate those wines in the New World, and we'll talk about that a bit more next time when we look at Virginia and the early plantings in that part of America. Another early settler in America and a Sonoma pioneer was a Hungarian Count, Harazzi. Csaba will no doubt correct my pronunciation on that, so he can chip in at some point. He planted the Vista Estate, which in a slightly different form is still going today, but more importantly he imported lots of cuttings of the classic vine varieties from France, and this really helped kickstart the wine industry in California as we know it today. The biggest spanner in the works, which most people know about, was Prohibition, which is the Volstead Act from 1920 to 1933, and this almost completely destroyed the wine industry. Some wineries were allowed to keep producing wine for communion. The church obviously had a dispensation to allow it to continue consuming communion wine, but there was a lot of, Prohibition wasn't entirely enforced strictly everywhere. Some of these wineries were actually producing 10 or even 12 different styles of communion wine, so clearly they weren't all being consumed in church. Also, some of the wineries you were allowed to sell grape juice or grape juice concentrate, and occasionally you would find these would be shipped to people's houses, or it would be bought with a very strict warning not to let it ferment in case it turned into an intoxicating beverage, which clearly you wouldn't want to do. After the end of Prohibition, some of the names that established the wine scene we still know today: the Gallows, Mondavi, and the Chilechev brothers. They at Bewley Vineyard, they were some early pioneers. From the mid-30s up until the 60s, a lot of the production and the local taste, particularly in the domestic market, was for fortified wines, and we've seen this in other areas as well that we've looked at. And it wasn't really until the 60s that we saw the emergence of the more modern styles with a bit of French oak aging and that kind of thing. Bewley Vineyard were one of the first to use French oak and small oak barrels to mature their Cabernets, which was unusual at the time in America, and it really started the ball rolling with what we now sort of identify with California Cabernet and Chardonnay. Also at roughly the same time, the University of California at Davis has a now world-renowned viticultural centre, and this in the 60s was really revitalised, and it started to train the new generation of winemakers in the California and the world around. It's now, winemakers come from all over the world, even Bordeaux, to the University at Davis to work to learn about more modern winemaking practices. The defining moment that really changed the perception of Californian wine throughout the world actually started off in quite a modest way. Stephen Spurrier was a wine merchant who owned a shop in Paris, and he decided the wines of California he thought were doing really well and were coming along quite nicely. So he thought it would be instructive to do a tasting of the Californian Cabernets and Chardonnays against the best Bordeaux and Burgundy from France of the time, and a blind tasting. And it was him and a group of French wine critics and winemakers who tasted these wines blind. And it actually caused a real upset at the time, because 12 out of 20 of the American wines won. So a clear majority of the American wines won over the French wines. A lot of the French winemakers and critics cried foul, They said it was a setup, but really with a blind tasting, there's no real way of saying it's unfair. It was a completely fair fight, and the Americans won. And from that moment on, word spread, and Californian wine started to be taken much more seriously. California is a huge state. It's very nearly twice the size of the United Kingdom, so obviously moving from north to south, you're going to get a huge range of geography, topography, and climates as you sort of move to the warmer areas down towards Los Angeles and think of the cooler areas up around San Francisco Bay. The state's divided into roughly four to five main areas: the north coast, the Sierra foothills and inland valleys to the east of San Francisco, the central coast and the south coast. And within this, we'll do a roughly north to south look at the main wine areas and try a few representative wines along the way. Most northerly, we have Mendocino County and Lake County, which are above Napa and Sonoma. Both counties are mainly forested. They're a bit of a nature lover's paradise, as a lot of California is. It's a very sort of rugged and beautiful state. There's a high proportion of organic and biodynamic wines from this area. There's a lot of more artisanal production than you might find in some of the bigger inland areas. There's lots of plantings of Cabernet and Pinot Noir, a bit of Zinfandel, and some old plantings of Barbera. I don't see a huge amount of wines from this area, but they're worth seeking out, particularly from Anderson Valley. It has some of the best Pinot Noir in Mendocino. Being close to the ocean, they also produce some really nice Gewürztraminer and Riesling in a sort of very Alsace late harvest style sometimes. There's some really nice aromatic wines coming out of this area. San Francisco Bay, in the words of Jancis Robinson, is California's air conditioning unit. Off the coast of California, the Pacific has a permanent fog bank because the temperatures of the ocean are freezing compared to the much warmer temperatures on the land. And what happens at night is this funnels in through the bay and into the inland valleys, having a cooling effect and naturally retaining the acidity in the wines and having that lovely sort of difference between the daytime and nighttime temperature that you find in some of the best classic wine regions of the world, which helps retain that balance between lovely fruit character from the sun and the balancing acidity. The Sonoma Valley, just above San Francisco, is nearer to the ocean and has naturally cooler overnight temperatures, as we mentioned. There's wineries there such as Geyserville from Francis Ford Coppola, Ridge Wines, and further south in the area is the Russian River Valley, which is some of the best wines come from. The Russian River actually runs all the way through Mendocino, right through Sonoma, but some of the best wines come from the Russian River Valley AVA. Some really good Chardonnays and Pinots come from this area. Above Russian River Valley is Alexander Valley, and being slightly further inland and slightly further away from the cooling fogs, you tend to find more Cabernet here, and it's this grape that really holds sway and makes some fantastic wines in this slightly warmer area. In southern Sonoma, it's old and in some cases ancient vine Zinfandel that makes some really fantastic wines. Again, these are from the early settlers, so some of these vines are sort of over 120, 130 years old. Low cropping, but they produce some really fantastic fruit. In the cooler northern areas, Cabernets really don't ripen properly, and we're tending to find here people are planting more Syrah and Grenache and making wines in a very much more northern Rhone terroir-driven style with this slightly cooler climate. And there's some interesting wines coming out of here as well. We don't see them too much in the UK at the moment, but they're worth seeking out, particularly if you ever visit the area. They're really, really good, cool climate wines. Carneros is slightly below Sonoma and Napa, more towards the bay, so again, quite a cool area. With some really nice Pinot and Chardonnay from here again, but we're also seeing things like Vermentino and Albarino coming from this area. They're planting sort of a wider range of varietals to give it a bit more diversity to the wines they make. Next we come to Napa. Now this is the name that most people know when they look at the US. Regardless of where you're looking in California, Napa is the big name. Only accounts for 4% of the plantings, but about 20% of the value, because most of the wines from here, in some instances, are eye-wateringly expensive. World class certainly, but very expensive. Some of them, like Screaming Eagle, have gained a cult status and command the same sort of prices as First Growth Bordeaux. What we're seeing is that these wines are collectible, but they're traded more like commodities than a beverage, and I think it's kind of a shame that wines become almost like this iconic status where it's less important than what's in the bottle rather than its rarity. On the Napa Valley floor, we have the three main areas of Rutherford, Oakville and Stag's Leap, which is an interesting name we'll come to. Rutherford Cabernet has a long history. One of the first wineries here is Inglenook, which was revitalised and given a new lease of life by Francis Coppola, the filmmaker. In Rutherford, there's really good drainage, similar to that you find in the gravel banks and the left bank of the Gironde in Bordeaux, and this gives the wines a really lovely minerality, particularly the Cabernets. Very age-worthy and some really good wines. Oakville, the next one along, is where we find Robert Mondavi Winery. He's one of the early names. He started up in the 30s, and the winery that still bears his name is hugely successful. They make some fantastic Cabernets, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and he was one of the first producers to actually label the wine Cabernet Sauvignon rather than Claret or Bordeaux, or in the case of Chardonnay, it was often just labelled as white Burgundy. Californian Burgundy through the 60s, 70s and 80s was absolutely huge, but now it's much more commonly labelled varietally. The next AVA we come to, and it's worth mentioning here, AVA is a bit like AOC in France. It's American Viticultural Area. It's just a designated area where the wines from that area are deemed to be of a particular quality and typical of that area, so they're given an AVA status. Stag's Leap is home to Stag's Leap Winery. There's a slight problem with the apostrophes in the wineries. The Stag's Leap AVA has no apostrophe. The Stag's Leap Winery I'm going to talk about next has Stag apostrophe S in its name, and the Stag's Leap Wine Company has Stag's apostrophe after the S, just to differentiate it. Really confusing and annoying, but the Stag's Leap Winery that was started in 1970 is the one I'm going to talk about. Their 1973 Cabernet Sauvignon was the one that won their category in the Judgment of Paris, beating Chateau Mouton Rothschild and Haut-Brion. Now, bearing in mind the winery was planted in 1970, this was from vines that were barely 3 years old, which is astonishing that they could make a wine of that quality from such young vines. It's almost unheard of. This is as I mentioned before, this was a real turning point in Californian wine, and it was then that it started to be taken seriously, because previously it was seen, even in America, as just the source of cheap plonk jug wine, just something you'd have at the family barbecue, not something you'd take seriously. For that, you would buy your imported, proper French Claret and Burgundy. South of San Francisco, we have the area generically called South of the Bay, and this encompasses, among others, Monterey County, which produces a lot of bulk wine, but it also has some superb smaller producers as well. The breezes from Monterey Bay can be too frigid for the wineries on the valley floor, but where the wineries and the vines are slightly elevated, they can produce some really good quality wines. The valley floor tends to produce the sort of bulk wines, kind of thing you'd find on offer in the supermarkets and Costco's across America. What we're looking at here is the more interesting, smaller producers. The breezes that come in from Monterey Bay keep it quite cool, but it does mean that you have a longer ripening season. The grapes here are picked generally 2 weeks later than most of the rest of California because of these cooler temperatures, but it does mean that you get that longer ripening period. It means you get more complexity in the grapes. The longer and slower that they ripen, the more interesting the flavours that develop in the grape and then in the finished wine.